The morning Edwin Price stood before every man on the Hollowmere site and called Josephine Marlowe a forger. The flood water had not yet finished draining from the lower yard. She could still smell it, that particular cold smell of river mud and saturated timber that had lived in her clothes for 3 weeks. The site crew stood in a rough half-circle near the equipment shed, and Price stood at the head of the table they used for morning briefings. And he had a ledger open in front of him that was not his ledger. It was hers. He had taken it from the drafting room overnight, and he held it now the way a man holds something he believes belongs to him, by right of having picked it up. Gideon Ashcombe, Duke of Farleigh, stood to Price's left. He had not looked at Josephine since she arrived in the yard 3 minutes ago. That, more than Price's expression or the assembled crew or the open ledger, told her everything she needed to know about how the next hour would go. The plans filed under the name J. Marlowe, Price said, and his voice carried the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent weeks preparing for a moment. Bear a signature that cannot be genuine. The elder Marlowe has been dead for over 4 years. These plans were drawn more recently. Someone has been forging a dead man's name to secure contracts, and I believe this woman knows exactly who that someone is. He did not say her. He said this woman. He was looking directly at her when he said it. Josephine did not answer immediately. She set down the bag she was carrying, her own bag, the one she had brought from her father's workshop that morning because she had known, watching Price cross the yard toward the drafting room the previous evening, that today would require documentation. She opened it. She removed the firm's account ledger, the real one, the one with 14 years of entries in 2 distinct hands. And she walked to the table and laid it open beside Price's borrowed copy. And she pointed to a date. "My father's last entry," she said. "The 3rd of November, 1843. His hand, you can see the slope of it, the way the sevens are made." She turned 3 pages forward without looking at him. "The Kettlewell contract, filed January, 1845. 14 months after that last entry." She looked up then, not at Price, but at Gideon. "The drawings are correct. You know they are correct. The question before you is not whether a dead man drew them. The question is whether the work is sound, and whether the person who did it has the right to have done it." Gideon said nothing. "The question," Price said, "is one of fraud." "The question," Josephine said, still looking at Gideon, "is 14 months. Either my father drew those plans from beyond the grave, or someone else drew them and did it well enough that the Kettlewell lock has stood without incident for 3 years. I am telling you which it was. You can decide what to do with that." The crew was very quiet. Tom Hadley, the winch foreman, was looking at the ground. Young Callum at the back had his cap in his hands. These were the men she had worked alongside for 3 weeks. These were the men she had pulled off the winch platform 4 days ago when the gate gave. Gideon looked at her then, finally, directly, and what she saw in his face was not disbelief. It was the expression of a man who already knows the answer and cannot yet afford to say it aloud. "Miss Marlowe," he said, and his voice was careful in the way that careful voices are when they are covering something larger. "I think it best if you step away from the site while this matter is looked into properly, to let things settle." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up the account ledger and placed it in his hands. "The dates are in there," she said. "You will not need me to explain them." She picked up her bag. She walked across the yard in full view of every man present, Hadley and Callum, and the 6 others who had watched her redirect a failing gate with 40 seconds and a clear head. And she went out through the site gate and did not look back. 3 weeks earlier, The gray had not yet fully lifted from the sky when Gideon Ashcombe arrived at the lockworks at a run. The Hollow Mere site was already awake. It had been awake since well before dawn, because the temporary gate had been under pressure since the small hours, and everyone within half a mile of the works could hear the river pressing against it, not loudly, but steadily, the way water always presses, without urgency, without pause, with absolute intention. The morning was cold and damp and smelled of the coming flood, and the chalk on the drafting shed slate board had been dry for 4 hours. The correction filled the board in a small, exact hand. Not rough working out. The rough working out was on the separate sheet pinned below, covered in figures that moved from the problem to the solution in a sequence so direct it looked almost effortless. The board itself showed only the final answer. Revised gate tolerances, adjusted anchor points, a modified pressure distribution that accounted for the particular curve of the Hollow Mere channel. At the bottom right, a time. 4:47 in the morning. Josephine Marlowe was standing at the far end of the drafting shed, with chalk still on her fingers, when Gideon came through the door. Edwin Price was standing at the near end, looking at the board with the expression of a man who has just arrived at a party and found the best seat already taken. He had been on site for 40 minutes. He had spent 35 of those minutes drawing a preliminary sketch that now sat on the corner of the drafting table, incomplete. "Your Grace," Price said, turning with the smooth readiness of a man who had been waiting to turn. "I've been working through the problem. I believe I have the shape of a solution. It will need another hour to set down properly. But the principle is sound." Gideon looked at the slate board. He looked at the sheet below it. He looked at the time in the bottom right corner. Then he looked at Josephine. She had chalk on the first 2 fingers of her right hand and a smudge of it on her left wrist where she had braced against the board. She was 29 years old, and she had been running her father's engineering firm for 4 years under his name, because the alternative was watching 30 families lose their livelihoods when the contracts dried up. She had learned, in those 4 years, how to make herself useful without making herself visible. She had learned the particular skill of standing in a room so that a man could look at her work without having to look at her. She was doing it now. Gideon said, not unkindly. There was no cruelty in it. Only the complete certainty of a man who has never had reason to question his own categories. "Leave the thinking to the men, Miss Marlowe." He said it the way you might tell a child to step back from a hot grate. Protective, even. Automatic. Josephine stepped aside so he could read what she had already solved. She watched him look at the board. She watched the slight adjustment in his posture as the figures resolved themselves. The moment when a man who understands engineering recognizes correct engineering, regardless of his intentions. She watched him look at Price's incomplete sketch. She watched the small, careful neutrality settle over his face as he made a decision that had nothing to do with the mathematics. "Price," Gideon said, "finish your solution. I want it on the table in an hour." "Of course, Your Grace." "Miss Marlowe." He glanced at her briefly. "Your father's firm has the temporary gate maintenance contract. See that the crew follows whatever Price recommends." He left the drafting shed. Through the small high window, she could hear him speaking to the foreman outside. Crisp, authoritative, the voice of a man accustomed to having his decision stand without discussion. Price looked at the slate board. Then he looked at Josephine with a particular expression of a man who has just been handed a gift he did not earn and knows it. "I'll need the anchor measurements from the lower channel survey," he said. Josephine went to the survey file and found the measurements and gave them to him without speaking. She had made peace with invisibility a long time ago. It was not peace in the way that contentment is peace. It was more like the particular stillness of a person who has decided that the work matters more than the credit, and has repeated that decision so many times it has worn a groove in their thinking. 30 families. The Hadley family, whose eldest son had just started as an apprentice on this site. Old Mrs. Fenwick, whose son ran the timber supply. The quiet web of dependency that ran through a working firm and held people in place. She had chosen the groove. But she had never, before this morning, watched a stranger's inferior plan chosen over her correct one purely on the strength of his coat. She had been invisible before, but invisibility had at least meant her work was used. This was something different. This was her work on the board and Price's sketch on the table, and Gideon Ashcombe walking out the door with a wrong answer in his hand. She stood at the drafting table after Price began copying her figures into his own notation. He was good enough to know what was right, not good enough to have reached it himself. And she looked at the chalk on her fingers, and she felt something shift in the groove, very slightly, like a gate under pressure. Not enough to give. Not yet. But she felt it. Price's reinforcement held through the first tidal cycle. The crew declared it solid. Price accepted their approval with the graciousness of a man who had expected nothing less. Gideon inspected the joint at low water and pronounced it adequate. And Josephine stood at the edge of the equipment shed and watched the water level and said nothing to anyone. The second tidal cycle came in at 2 in the afternoon, 3 days later, with a south wind behind it that added 8 inches of surge pressure to the calculation. She had noted the surge risk in her original correction on the slate board. The board had been wiped clean and replaced with Price's final drawings before noon on the day of the first cycle. The lower joint began seeping at 2:47. Not catastrophically, a slow, dark line of water appearing at the base of the reinforcement, widening as the surge held. Exactly where her chalk notation had marked the weak point. She was still watching from the equipment shed when Gideon crossed the yard toward her. He did not explain himself. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at the seeping joint and then at her, and his expression had lost the procedural certainty it had carried in the drafting shed. What was there instead was harder to name. A man who has made a decision and is watching its consequences materialize, and has not yet decided what to do about that. "How would you reinforce it?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was the sentence of a man who has decided to ask something before he has finished deciding to ask it. Josephine looked at the joint. The lower anchor is carrying load it wasn't designed for because the pressure distribution in Price's plan doesn't account for surge at this channel width. You need a secondary anchor plate at 45 degrees to the base, tied back to the original foundation bolts. The tolerances are, she named them, specific figures, load calculations she had carried in her head since the morning in the drafting shed. Gideon listened. He listened in the way she had not seen him listen before. Without the layer of credential checking that had been between him and her work every previous time she had spoken in his presence. He was listening to the figures, not to her, which was the closest thing to being heard she had experienced in 4 years. "Can it be done before the next cycle?" he asked. She answered simply, "Yes." He looked at the joint again. Then he looked at her, and something in his face shifted. Not an apology, not yet, but the beginning of something that might eventually become one. "Stay on," he said. There won't be a formal arrangement, but stay on." She knew what he was not saying. He was not saying, "I was wrong." He was not saying, "I will tell Price." He was not saying anything that would cost him anything publicly. He was asking her to continue doing the work, invisibly, on the same terms she had always worked on. And the only thing that had changed was that he now knew the terms existed. She should have said no. She had told herself, walking across the site yard after the first title cycle, that if the joint gave, she would say no. But the gate was still at risk, and she could not make herself leave while it was. "All right," she said. The drafting room at Farleigh Chase was a long room on the north side of the house, with windows that let in the gray northern light that engineers prefer. Steady, shadowless, honest. Gideon had given her access to it after the second tidal cycle without making a formal statement about having done so. He had simply appeared in the doorway one evening while she was working at the table and looked at what she was doing and pulled up a chair on the opposite side. That was how the evenings began. He would arrive after dinner, still in the clothes he'd worn on site, and spread plans across the table and ask her opinion in the careful way of a man who is asking but has not yet admitted, even to himself, that he is asking. He would say things like, "I've been looking at the Upper Channel survey. What do you make of the gradient here?" And she would look at the gradient and tell him what she made of it, and he would listen, and sometimes he would push back. And she liked it better when he pushed back, because it meant he was actually thinking rather than simply receiving. She began to understand, in those evenings, how his mind worked. It was not a bad mind. It was a disciplined mind, trained to work from established principle toward known outcomes, good for executing plans, less comfortable with the moment when the plan and the reality diverge. He had been educated at the best institutions, trained by the best men, surrounded his entire professional life by people who deferred to his judgment. The habit of deference had become, for him, a kind of confirmation. He had forgotten, somewhere in those 20 years, that deference and correctness are not the same thing. She was thinking about this, or something adjacent to it, on the fourth evening, when they both reached for the same rolled plan at the same moment. His hand covered hers, not deliberately. It was the simple accident of two people moving toward the same object at the same time. But neither of them pulled back immediately. There was a beat, 2, perhaps 3 seconds, in which both of them were aware of the contact, and neither of them did anything about it. Then she drew her hand back and unrolled the plan and smoothed it flat on the table, and he said nothing, and they continued working. 2 days after that, during a site inspection at the upper platform, the flood surge came in harder than expected, and the platform shook. Gideon reached out and caught her arm. A fast, instinctive movement, pulling her back from the edge before she had processed the need to step back. He held her there while the surge passed. Then he looked down and found his hand still on her arm, and let go with the particular care of a man who is trying to make a deliberate action look like the natural conclusion of an involuntary one. "The platform bracing should be checked," he said. She agreed. Yes. Price, who had been watching the hours accumulate in the drafting room with increasing attention, began making small obstructions. Her supply order for the secondary anchor materials was delayed 3 days without explanation. Her timeline estimates disappeared from the morning briefing sheets, not struck through, simply absent, as though they had never been submitted. Nothing that could be named directly. Nothing that left a mark you could point to. She noted each one. She adjusted her timelines accordingly. She said nothing to Gideon, because saying something to Gideon would have required explaining how she knew, and explaining how she knew would have required him to choose a side at a moment when he had not yet finished deciding there were sides to choose between. She was patient. She had been patient for 4 years. On the 7th evening in the drafting room, they were alone. Price had been at the estate office all afternoon, and the crew had gone home. and the lamp was burning low by the time they reached the sluice gate drawings. Gideon was looking at the upper measurement along the gate's bearing surface, and he said, "Walk me through your calculation here." And she leaned over the drawing and began. Halfway through, he reached across and took her hand and guided it along the measurement line, the way a teacher might guide a student's hand. Except that she had done this calculation correctly, and he knew it. And both of them knew he knew it. His fingers were warm and deliberate, and the pretext was thin enough to see through, and she let the calculation finish before she lifted her hand away. "The figures are right," she said. "I know," he said. He did not look embarrassed. He looked like a man who has made a small, honest admission and is uncertain what comes next. She said, almost without intending to, "I filed a written memo a week ago about the lower joint, the surge tolerance. It should have come to you through the site correspondence." Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, a very small stillness, the kind that means a thought has arrived that the body has not yet processed. "I didn't receive it," he said. She said nothing. He said, "Price handles the site correspondence." She said nothing. He sat for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "What did the memo say, precisely?" She told him. The exact figures, the specific failure point, the timing she had predicted. He listened, and she watched the stillness in his face deepen into something that was not quite anger and not quite shame, but contained elements of both. He did not say anything after she finished. He said good night, and she went home, and he remained in the drafting room. She did not know, until later, what he did there. But she could have guessed, because the drafting room contained 4 years of Marlowe plans, rolled and filed in the cabinet along the north wall, and a man who has just been told that the handwriting on those plans deserves a second look will find, if he pulls them out and examines them in sequence, that the hand is the same throughout. Her father's looser, more generous strokes in the early years. Then a gap. Then the same small exact hand that covered the slate board at 4:47 in the morning, appearing on every plan from January 1845 forward. The tolerances tightening year by year. The annotations always correct. Gideon sat with the last plan for a long time before he rolled it up and put it back. The lower joint gave at mid-morning on a Tuesday, with the sun out and the water running high from 3 days of upstream rain. It did not give slowly. There was a sound, a single wet crack, sharp enough that Tom Hadley looked up from the supply manifest he was reading 30 yards away. And then the gate dropped 6 inches in 4 seconds, and the winch platform below it lurched, and the 3 men on the platform grabbed whatever they could reach and held on. Josephine was already moving. She had been watching the joint since 8 that morning. She had been watching it because the upstream water level had climbed 6 inches overnight, and Price's reinforcement had not been designed for sustained high water combined with surge. And she had done the arithmetic in her head while eating breakfast and arrived at the site knowing that today was the day. Gideon shouted for the winch crew to hold position. "No," Josephine said, and her voice came out flat and clear and carrying, the voice she used when the figures left no room for discussion. "Hadley, get to the upper winch. Release the secondary chain 3 turns only, not more. Callum, take the left brace and hold it against the frame. Don't let it swing. Morrison, step back to the platform edge and wait for my word." 3 seconds of nothing. In those 3 seconds, Gideon could have countermanded her. He did not. Hadley went to the upper winch. Callum took the brace. Morrison moved to the platform edge. "Hadley, now, 3 turns." The chain released. The gate shuddered and dropped another ½ inch, but slowly this time, controlled. the pressure distributing across the secondary brace instead of slamming into the lower joint. The platform steadied. Josephine watched the joint, watching for the secondary crack that would mean it was going entirely, and it did not come. "Morrison, off the platform, go." Morrison went. Callum followed. Hadley came down from the upper winch at a run, and the three men stood in the yard breathing hard while the gate held at its new, lower position, water sheeting over the top in a controlled pour rather than a catastrophic breach. 40 seconds. The yard was very quiet. Gideon was standing 2 yards behind her. She was aware of him there without turning around, aware of him the way you are aware of a person who is watching you, with an attention that is different from the attention of the rest of the crowd. She turned to check the joint one more time, and when she turned back, he was right there, closer than she had realized, and he took her hand. Not a gesture of assistance, not a protective instinct. He simply took her chalk-stained hand in both of his and held it, and neither of them said anything for a moment, standing in the wet yard with the sound of the controlled pour behind them and the crew beginning to breathe normally again around them. Then he said, "The memo." His voice was very quiet. "I want you to know that I—" "Not now," she said, not harshly. But the site was full of people, and Price was crossing the yard from the equipment shed with an expression she recognized, and whatever Gideon had been about to say would need to wait for a moment when it could be said completely. He released her hand. They both turned toward the gate, and toward Price, and toward what was coming. Price made his accusation the following morning. He had spent the night preparing it. That was clear from the way he stood at the briefing table. The ledger already open, the specific pages already marked, the crew already assembled before Gideon arrived. He had done everything he could to ensure that the first word spoken would be his, and the frame around the morning's business would be the one he had built. He laid it out methodically. The signature on the plans, the dates, the fact that James Marlowe had died in September of 1843, and the Kettlewell contract bore his name in January of 1845. Forgery, he said. Fraud. The Duke of Farleigh had been deceived into contracting with a firm that was operating under false pretenses, and the woman standing at the edge of the yard knew exactly what had been done. Josephine listened to all of it. She had known it was coming, had known since she watched Price cross toward the drafting room 2 evenings ago. And she had spent the intervening time not in anxiety, but in preparation, which was the only response to an anticipated problem that she had ever found useful. She laid the account ledger on the table. She pointed to the dates and the handwriting. She asked Gideon, plainly and without drama, whether the drawings were correct regardless of whose hand had made them. And Gideon, who had read 4 years of plans the night before last and knew the answer, said he needed things to settle and put the ledger in her hands and sent her away. She walked out of the site yard and down the lane toward her father's workshop without looking back. And she did not cry until she was inside with the door closed. And even then, it was brief. Not grief, exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time and has just been told to keep carrying it. She sat at her father's work table and opened the firm's accounts and looked at the numbers for a long time. The contracts, the outstanding work, the families whose employment ran through Marlowe and Sons like a root system through soil. She could let it fold. She had never let herself think that before, but she thought it now, clearly and without flinching. She could let it fold before she would beg for credit she had already earned. That was not pride. That was the last boundary she had. She was still sitting there when the light changed and the afternoon went gray. And she was still sitting there when she heard footsteps on the lane outside. Not a servant's footsteps, not the quick, practical stride of a man on an errand, but the slower, deliberate walk of someone who is choosing each step. The knock on the door was not the knock of a man who expected to be let in. It was the knock of a man who was uncertain whether he had the right to be there and had come anyway. She opened the door. Gideon stood on the step with the account ledger under his arm and the particular expression of a man who has spent 2 days reading something and has arrived at conclusions he cannot unknow. "May I come in?" he said. The estate office was a formal room with a mahogany table and 2 tall windows, and it smelled of old paper and lamp oil. And on the morning 2 days after the flood, it contained the estate steward, the village solicitor, Edwin Price, and Gideon Ashcombe, Duke of Farleigh. Price had pressed for the hearing himself. He had spent the previous 2 days telling anyone who would listen that the Duke had been defrauded and that the matter required official record. And he had arrived that morning with the borrowed ledger copy and the expression of a man who has already decided how the proceedings will end. Gideon laid her father's death certificate on the table first. Then the Kettlewell contract. Then he read the dates aloud, not as argument, not as emotional appeal, but as arithmetic, the way she would have read them. September 3rd, 1843. January 14th, 1845. The gap was 14 months and 11 days. He named the figure and let it sit. The plans filed under J. Marlowe from January 1845 forward, he said, were drawn by Miss Josephine Marlowe, principal engineer of the firm, working under her father's initial because a woman's name closes doors that the work itself should open. The plans are correct. The Kettlewell lock has stood without incident for 3 years. The hollow mere reinforcement that failed under surge pressure last Tuesday was not her work. It was Mr. Price's, approved over her written objection, and that objection was filed in writing 1 week before the failure and was not delivered to me. He looked at Price. "I will be interested to understand why." The solicitor was writing. The steward was very still. The question of who handled the correspondence, Price began, "is a separate inquiry," Gideon said. "Which will happen. What is before us now is the record." He turned to the solicitor. "All future plans from Marlowe and Sons will carry the name Josephine Marlowe, without initial, without ambiguity. That is to be noted. The site memo filed 1 week before the gate failure is to be entered into the site record dated as received, which was the date she filed it, not the date I saw it." Price said nothing. He had no counter-document because there was no counter-document. The dates were what they were, and the dates were all that was needed. After the solicitor had finished writing and the steward had witnessed the additions to the record, Gideon picked up the death certificate and the Kettlewell contract and put them in his coat pocket. He did not go back to the estate. He did not go to the drafting room. He went directly to the lane that led to the shuttered workshop on the edge of the village, and he knocked on a door he had never knocked on before. She let him in. The workshop was small and precise and smelled of chalk and old paper and the particular dry smell of a room that has been used for serious work for many years. Her father's drafting table was against the far wall, and her own was beside it. And the accounts were still open where she had left them 2 days ago. Gideon stood in the middle of the room and did not sit down. He said, "I want to tell you something about my father." She settled onto the edge of the drafting stool and waited. "I was 17, he said. He had brought the estate engineer to dinner, a man named Wickfield, very well regarded, very credentialed. I had been looking at Wickfield's drawings for the new mill channel, and I had found what I believed was an error in the load calculation. I said so at dinner. He paused. My father found it very amusing. He explained to Wickfield, in front of the whole table, that his son had developed ideas above his instruction, and that this was what came of letting boys read engineering texts before they had the Latin to understand anything properly. Wickfield laughed. Everyone laughed. He looked at her directly. Wickfield's calculation was wrong, he said. The mill channel had to be rebuilt 2 years later at considerable expense. But what I learned that evening, what I spent the next 21 years learning without realizing I was learning it, was that being wrong in public is the worst thing that can happen to a man, and the safest protection against it is credential. Qualification, the right school, the right training, the right name on the plan. He stopped. I gave Price's plan precedence over yours because his coat was better than yours, and his degree was on paper, and your degree was on the board, and I had not yet learned to read the difference. The workshop was quiet. Outside, a cart went by on the lane. I read your drawings, he said. All 4 years of them. 2 nights ago in the estate office. I sat with them for 3 hours, and I read every annotation and every tolerance figure. And I want you to know that what you have built, under a name that was never fully yours, without acknowledgement, without... He stopped again, and this time the stop was not for effect, but because he had reached the edge of what his usual careful language could manage. You should not have had to work that way. That is what I want to say. Not as an excuse, as a fact. Josephine looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I have a condition. He answered at once. Yes. My name on every plan, not an initial, not a managing partner's signature over mine, my full name, and no ambiguity about what it means. Yes, he said, before she had finished the sentence. She looked at him. You didn't let me finish. You were going to say something about future contracts as well, he said. And the answer is still yes. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the expression of a person who has been serious for a very long time and has just been given unexpected reason to stop. The hearing this morning, she said. Done. Your name is in the record. Price's reinforcement will face its own inquiry. I suspect he will not remain on the site much longer. He looked at her steadily. The cornerstone for the rebuilt lock. I've spoken to the mason. He's waiting for the name. The rebuilt gate's first successful trial was on a Thursday in late June. With the summer light coming level across the water and the smell of warm grass coming down from the upper meadows. The crew had been there all morning and had gone home by 4, satisfied and loud and celebrating in the way of men who have done difficult work well. The site was empty by 5. The water ran clean through the new sluice, the tolerances exactly what the plan specified. The gate holding its position without a tremor. Josephine was standing at the upper platform, looking at the joint, the correct joint, the rebuilt joint, the one that bore her calculations. When Gideon came and stood beside her, he said, I told myself, the morning in the drafting shed, that I was being practical, that Price's credentials were the relevant consideration. He was looking at the gate, not at her. I have been telling myself practical things for 21 years. I have become very good at it. I know, she said. I am less good at the other kind of thing. He turned then and looked at her, and his face had none of the procedural certainty she had first seen in the drafting shed. The flood gave me no time to say it. The hearing was not the place. I am saying it now, in the only place I can think of where the work is already done, and there is nothing left to hide behind. She looked at him for a moment. Then she took one step forward and kissed him, and his hand came up to her face with the same certainty as the hand that had pulled her from the platform edge. Instinctive, immediate, completely without pretense. The water ran through the new sluice below them, steady and even, the way water runs through a gate that has been built correctly. 1 year later, the drafting room at Hollowmere was lit by lamps on a summer evening, and 2 sets of plans shared one long table. Her hand was on the upper section and his was on the lower, and they had been arguing for 20 minutes about the gradient of the new mill channel, a productive argument, the kind where both parties are right about different aspects of the same problem and both know it. "The survey puts the fall at 1 in 40, she said, pointing to the figure. "The survey is from March," Gideon said. "The spring water table will have shifted the bank. Then we resurvey the bank." He agreed readily. "We resurvey the bank." The lamp burned between them and the plans covered the table, and outside the window the rebuilt lock sat solid in the summer dark. And on its cornerstone, cut deep into the stone by a mason who had been told to take his time and do it properly, were the words, "Josephine Marlowe, engineer, 1848. The name was not an initial. It was not a managing partner's signature. It was not a dead man's hand. It was hers, exactly and completely, as it had always been.